Hi, everyone. Hoping that you all are well and enduring these interesting weather patterns. If you are enduring such, what we're going to be doing is addressing the issue of the disappearing Celtic diaspora. Hopefully, you've had an opportunity to look in the community section and take a glance at some of those Welsh surnames. Many of you might find some of your grandparents' surnames on that list. And that will help to make this discussion and the continuing discussions relevant to you and your history. And so what we're going to be doing is we're going to be addressing the Celtic phenotype. This is an introductory discussion, even though we've talked about Celtic history in the past. We're going to approach this as an introduction. And so we're going to be looking at the Celtic phenotype. We're going to be looking at some ethnic traces with respect to the Celtic people, and some of the linguistic dynamics that might answer the questions about why some of your grandparents could not read or write in English. And as a foundation here, these are some of the names that are associated with Celt or Celtic. Some of those names, in terms of place names, are Cambria, Cambridge, Cumberland, Kimry, Wales, Walla or Vala, and Valhalla. If some of you have been to Germany or Deutschland, you may have learned the hard way that W is not pronounced W for the most part. It's pronounced with the V sound. And so instead of wash, you would have vosh. So to get us started, it's important that you are able to see the screen as we are going through this discussion and subsequent discussions, because there will be visual things that will aid in your understanding of what is going on here. And so we've talked about the phenotype of the early Celts before. And so we're just going to look at these phenotypes. What do they actually look like? So you hear the description of brunette skin color. And so what does brunette skin color look like? And so you can see on the screen what brunette skin color looks like, and it is synonymous with the hair color that is on the individual on the left hand side. And so this is the brunette skin tone that is associated with the early Celt phenotype. And as you can see, it's a deep brown skin color with sort of golden, reddish golden, coppery highlights to it, but it is essentially a deep brown skin color. Now, there was another phenotype that went along with early Celtic ancestry. It wasn't just associated with skin color and hair, but it also was related to body structure. And so this other phenotype that went along with this Celtic identity was one where the hair was sort of a reddish brunette color. And so sort of this reddish brown looking color that you often attribute to individuals of Irish descent. You will see the head full of red, curly, coily hair. You'll also tend to see what are known as freckles. And freckles are simply melanin deposits. And so you will see these sporadic spreads of melanin deposits on the skin of people who have red hair. There's a tendency towards this. And now is probably a good time to talk about the diversity in skin color. Many people who live in fantasy land come up with all of these fictitious explanations for the dark skin tones and the lighter skin tones. And one explanation is that either one or the other is not actually human. But basically, all you have here is a situation where there is a certain level of albinism going on. Individuals who are considered light-skinned, black people even, are exhibiting a degree of albinism. And so when you see that light coppery color, or you see even lighter colors, what you are seeing is a degree of albinism. When you see individuals with freckles, what you are seeing is a mixture of the albinism and the melanism sort of mixed together. And so you are seeing manifestations of albinism, but you are also seeing manifestations of melanism in the same individual. And if people are honest, what they would admit is that melanin almost acts as an overlay, because if there is any infringement upon the melanin, breaks in the skin, scrapes, what you see under that is what appears the same as albinism. And so you see this very light whitish skin color when there is scarring, when there is an injury to the skin. And so this melanism, albinism dynamic is a very dynamic. And you may see manifestations of melanism and albinism in the same individual. Sometimes the melanism is in the hair and the eyes, and you may see albinism in the skin. And you may see this whether the person is dark or light. You may see these variations. And so the Celtic people, for whatever reason, had this interesting dynamic of this very visible manifestation of albinism and melanism in the same individual. And you can even see if the individual was completely covered with what looks like the melanism spots, they would look like a relatively brown, dark brown individual. If they were, however, completely covered with the lighter portions, they would simply look like what you would identify as a white person. And you also see manifestations of albinism in the form of vitiligo with individuals who have darker brown skin. So moving on with our introduction of the Celtic people, we're going to be looking at this piece known as Races and Peoples, Lectures on the Science of Ethnography. This book is from 1901. There is a caveat with this book. The book does go into great detail with respect to the phenotype of certain groups of people. However, some of the psychological analyzing of the individuals is relatively off. And so it should not be used for that purpose. But in terms of just getting a description of some groups of people across the world, it does a fairly good job of pointing out some of the physiological dynamics of individuals, some of the anatomical dynamics of individuals. And this discussion is important for a number of reasons. One reason is that even back then, there was an admittance that the Celtic people were basically disappearing, and that there was a concern that within a few generations they would be completely extinct. Another thing that's noted here is that the Celtic people are understood as an Aryan stock, an Aryan stock. And so some people might be surprised to hear that, but that's based upon the cultural construction of what it means to be Aryan, which is inconsistent with the actual definition and the etymology of Aryan. And so what happened was, according to Britannica, was that people were given this name Aryan when they were understood as being associated in prehistoric times with ancient Iran or the northern Indian subcontinent. However, that's not consistent with the name Aryan. And often when you see the R, it is associated with this idea of nobility or royalty. This R designation carries itself that way in many languages. And so here you see an additional discussion about this more recent rejection of the Aryan invasion hypothesis and understanding Arya or Arya as simply noble or distinguished. And so it's now understood as a social construct of position versus ethnicity. And so these individuals were understood in earlier times as being the sole representatives of the Highlands in Scotland, the Irish people, the Manx people, the Welsh people, and the native people of Brittany and France. Now, it's important to note that we're talking about the natives. We're talking about indigenous people for the most part when we're talking about these groups, because many of these groups have been supplanted by other groups, particularly when you're talking about the Celtic people. The people who are identifying as Celtic now over in Europe are probably not the Celtic people. There may be some that were left behind, but for the most part, there was a sort of sweeping them up and getting them up and out of there so that their land could be taken and their identities could be stolen, and they could be superimposed with other identities, and then other individuals moving in and superimposing themselves onto those spaces. And so one of the concerns is that Celtic speech was also losing ground before English or French. And so there were very few people who could actually speak Irish. There were people who could barely speak anything related to Gaelic, people who could barely speak the Welsh language. And these are not the same as English. And so you had a lot of Irish people who could not speak English. You had Irish people who could not speak the tongue that they were expected to speak in the colonized lands. The same applied to the Welsh and to the Scots. And so therefore it made it very difficult for them, because then they also could not read or write in English. And you might note this when you look at the census. You had individuals, in terms of your great grandparents, who were able to speak the language, but because it was not really their native tongue, and then those other grandparents couldn't pass it down. They couldn't pass English down to them because it wasn't their native tongue. It was very difficult for them in terms of reading and writing. So it's not just that they weren't taught, it's that it was not their native tongue. And so English did not belong to them. English belonged to another group of people who were understood as the colonizers in this particular instance. And so here's a discussion about these dialects also. So the Celtic groups formed two dialects. One was spoken in Scotland, Ireland, and the Isle of Man, and this was known as Gaelic. The other was common to Wales and Brittany, and also to Cornwall. And get this, the name of it is Armorican. Alternately, it was known as Cymric. Now, along with the pattern of naming a people consistent with their language, you have individuals who would be understood as Armorican simply because that was the dialect that was spoken. And so when individuals came over to the place that's now known as America, it's highly likely that America, as we've talked about before, was just a manifestation of this people group and the dialect that was being spoken. And so you have the same thing going on with Africa, where you have this entire continent known as Africa now. However, this name Africa traces back to, as we've discussed before, a European foundation, a Scots foundation, a Gaelic foundation. And so because there was a loss of language, you have a loss of culture, because language sort of serves as the foundation of the culture. It's how you communicate the culture in many ways. And so there was this loss of culture that went along with losing the Celtic languages. And so as the Celtic people were dispersed around the world, you saw this taking up of other languages, losing of their own languages, and also being penalized for not knowing the other languages. And so not knowing English in an English speaking space could be detrimental. There was a language recovery movement that assisted somewhat, but there would need to be more of a language recovery movement going on, and it would need to be broad and it would need to be global for all of the Celtic people to absorb that and reclaim that part of their identity. One thing that is noteworthy is when you look at names in English and you look at the Celtic translation, it's almost impossible to make that leap because they don't look like the same words. They don't look like variations, of the same word. In many instances, they look like totally different words. And one thing that's also noted about the Celtic language, the Welsh, is that it looks interestingly like some of the writings that are supposed to be American Indian languages. And so that's just something to keep in mind because it's pretty glaring, quite frankly. But anyway, so what you have here is an assertion that there is a need for this language recovery. There's also an indication that you can see elements of Welsh language in certain dialects. You can even see some components in what is considered African American vernacular English. Now, of course, this is a writer who is writing in the 1900s, so 1901. And so many things have changed since that time. But the individual is indicating that to this day, the Celtic people present the same contrast of physical type that they did to the Romans. So it indicates that some of the Scot clans, many of the Irish, most of the Welsh and Britons are of a moderate stature with dark eyes and hair and a brunette complexion, while the remainder are tall, raw-boned, red hair with freckles and these tawny beards. Now, you were already warned about this author's psychoanalysis of people, but there are some observations that the individual is attempting to offer with respect to the mental traits and the behaviors of the Celtic people. And so there's an indication that they were experienced as turbulent, as boastful, as alert, courageous, but deficient in caution, persistence, and self-control. And there's also an indication that with respect to religious practices, that there was a tendency towards them being fanatic and bigoted. And so, in other words, there was an intolerance of religions that were not consistent with their own religion. Another term to keep in mind with respect to the Celtics, the Welsh people, is this word Cymric, and it essentially means Welsh in terms of the language or in terms of the culture. And so you can indicate that someone is Cymric, and when indicating that they are Cymric, the indication is that they are Welsh. So what we're going to do now is look at this interesting ancient map for Wales, also identified as Walla or Vala, Wallia in this particular rendition. This is Wales, essentially. So we're going to look at this map, just a couple of components on it. So check out this Celtic map here. On the right-hand side, of course, you continue to see Wales, Wallia. On the left-hand side, however, you see this main heraldry with Wales up at the top and these little cherubs with these strings that are attaching Wales to these other heraldry markers. And so under Wales, you see certain names. They are not completely clear, and the one on the bottom right-hand side is missing from this particular depiction, but with a magnifying glass, we were able to ascertain exactly what it is. Okay, so what you have is Bangor on the left-hand side there, and David's. Okay, then on the right-hand side, you have Llandaff, and then Asaph or Asaph. And this is so that you can see these terms more clearly. So you have Walla or Wallia and Wales, and then you see Asaph, you see Bangor, which means fence or enclosure. You see Landoff, which means pure or clean. And then you see Asaph and David. The reason why these names are important, in particular the Asaph and David, is because Asaph and David actually go together. These heraldry markers are providing some sort of indicia of a relationship between the Celtic people and the Jacob that we have been looking for. Now, the question of where is Jacob still remains, but here you see what we consider sort of like place markers, so you can see where Jacob has been based upon these place markers. Now, these individuals are not still in Wales. There was definitely a full-scale attempt to remove the people from Wales, the Celtic people, period, from that part of Europe, and then disperse them all over the world. Now, what it looks like is you have people that have perhaps taken over their identities, not only in the area of Europe, but in other places around the world, sort of just adopting these names that go along with the Welsh names. And if you look at the list in the community section, you can see some of those Welsh names. You're also encouraged to attempt to translate the Welsh name, if you see it related to your ancestors, into the Welsh so that you can see how difficult it is to automatically make that translation or that transliteration by simply looking at it. It will also give you some assistance when you are looking at ancestry in terms of finding your ancestors, because that Welsh translation is a serious one. And so you will see the difficulty that might be there and why you might need to look at different transliterations and different spellings of names when you are trying to track down your ancestors or try to understand your relationship to these names and these cultures. And so there are a couple of questions for consideration with respect to this introductory discussion. And it is, why has there been a move to move the Celtic people? Why are the Celtic people disappearing? Why has there been an ethnic cleansing of the Celtic people? What is the end game for all of this? I'm also going to point out something, that even though the people in, let's say, London are understood as being related to the people that are in America, in the Americas, there is a phenotype difference going on. So when you talk about even individuals who are identified as white, either in London or in the United States, those individuals don't really look alike. And so the question becomes, why don't they look alike if they are supposed to be the same people? Another question is, what does this mean in terms of the history of all of these different groups of people? If large numbers of Celtic people were moved from England, enslaved in England, and yes, enslaved, who are the people that are there now? Who replaced all of these Celtic people? Remember, knowledge is power. Take care. See you soon.